Okay, so in this segment, we'll start exploring answers to the question, where does morality come from? Remember, when we ask that question, we're not asking what the most general moral rules or guidelines are. Rather, we're asking whichever they are, whatever the right moral rules or guidelines are, where do they come from? What makes them the right ones? Rather than, some other guidelines or none at all. And here's a variety of proposals. People have suggested that morality comes from God. So God is the ultimate source of morality. Basically, if God says something is wrong, then it's wrong. If God says something is praiseworthy, morally good, then it is. If God is sort of neutral on something, then it's morally neutral. So the moral value of any given act is determined by what God says it is. Another possibility is that morality comes from culture. That is, there is no morality independent of culture, and each distinctive culture will have its own distinctive moral rules and guidelines. And the point here isn't that each culture is kind of getting at some aspect of the real morality. The point is rather that each culture determines its own morality, that culture itself determines which moral rules or guidelines are correct. So, insofar as different cultures have different moral rules or guidelines, each is equally correct in some sense. Uh, there's no way to evaluate competing moral frameworks independent of culture. Another possibility is that morality comes from meaning. This is the idea I mentioned last time, that a statement like sisters are siblings, you might think of as true in virtue of its meaning. That is, its meaning makes it true. You don't need to go out and check the world. You just need to understand it to see that it's true. And that reflects the fact that the meaning itself makes it true. And you might think the same is true for moral claims, that you can just see their truth or falsity right on their face. So when I say killing others for fun is good, you can see that that's false straight away. And when I say killing others for fun is bad, you can see that that's true straight away. And that ability to just see the truth by reflecting on the meaning indicates that the meaning itself makes the statement true. Finally, you might think that morality comes from human nature. This is the kind of positive proposal. And the idea here is there's facts about human psychology, about how human beings are built, and that determines the moral truths. The idea here you might think of as along these lines. Just like there's facts about human psychology, about how human beings are built, that make grammar be what it is and make there be a common grammar across languages. Similarly, there's facts about human psychology and how human beings are built that make there be a common morality across human peoples. Oh, sorry, there's one more view. I don't know why that one's labeled D. It should be 4. And that view says that there's fundamental moral entities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea is these other proposals try and tell you that morality comes from something other than itself, like God determines what's good and what's bad, culture determines what's good and what's bad, meaning does, or human nature does. On this view, there is goodness and badness, but nothing else is determining what's good and what's bad. It's just a basic part of the fabric of the universe. So you could think of it along these lines. Suppose I say, like, look, there's a table there, and you ask me, well, what's the source of the truth of the claim there's a table there? And I say, well, the source of the truth is that there's a bunch of atoms, a bunch of molecules arranged in a certain way. And the molecules being arranged in that way make it true that there's a table there. And you say, well, what makes it true that the molecules are arranged in that way? And I say, well, there's a bunch of atoms and they're bound together in a certain way. And you say, well, what makes it true that there's a bunch of atoms and they're bound together in a certain way? And we keep on going down lower and lower and lower until we get to some level where we can't say anything further. We're just saying, look, it's a basic fact that, the electrons and so on and fields are distributed the way they are. And you might say the same holds for morality. So when you ask me what makes it wrong to kill others for fun, I might say it's just wrong. It's a basic feature of the universe, just like the fact that there's an electron in a particular position is a basic feature of the universe. Okay. And of course, there's another view which says there is no morality. We'll talk about that view as well. So in this video, we'll focus on the idea that morality comes from God. So here's the basic idea. Morality comes from God. That is, God is the ultimate source of morality, making true moral claims true and false moral claims false. So if there's a true moral claim, it's true because that's what God says. If there's a false moral claim, it's false because that's what God says. So this idea that God is the ultimate source of morality was put forward by a person named Euthyphro in a conversation with Socrates, documented by Plato. Or if you think of Socrates, Plato as taking sort of a bit of license with Socrates as a character and not as a historical figure, we could say Euthyphro is a character in a dialogue by Plato in which Socrates is another character and they have a conversation. So you can either think of Plato as a journalist, kind of faithfully recording a conversation between Euthyphro and Socrates, or as a kind of playwright, making up a play between Euthyphro and Socrates, or something in between. At any rate, in this dialogue that Plato either made up or wrote down, he puts forward, the character Euthyphro suggests that morality comes from God, and Socrates is going to challenge that idea. So you can think of this as the Euthyphro thesis. So Plato argues that morality does not come from God. That is, and argues this using Socrates as his voice. He argues that God does not make the correct moral rules or guidelines be the correct moral rules or guidelines. Notice that Plato doesn't argue that God doesn't exist. That's crucial. Plato is a theist. A theist is someone who thinks that a god or gods exist. And in fact, Plato thought that there was one God. Socrates thought the same. He talked about the god regularly, using the definite article, the, rather than the indefinite article, a, to talk about God rather than gods. So Plato doesn't argue that God doesn't exist. In fact, he thinks that God does exist, but he thinks that God can't be the source of morality. Okay, it's important also to think that Plato doesn't argue that God is flawed. There is a popular view at the time that there were many gods and that each had their virtues and each had their vices. They had flaws. That was not Plato's view. That was not Socrates' view. They thought God was perfect. So the point when we say morality doesn't come from God is not that God is flawed in some way. It's rather this. Plato makes a point about metaphysical priority. What he says is God identifies wrong actions as wrong because of their wrongness, rather than the actions being wrong because God identifies them as wrong. And I know that can be a hard thought to get on first pass, so I want you to think about it for a minute. You can pause the video and think about it, read it over. But the basic idea, you think of it like this. Suppose there's some book that I really like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I really like that book. And I say it's the best book ever. And you can ask me a question. What makes it the best book ever? And here are two very different responses. I can say, well, I like it because it is the best book ever. And what makes it the best book ever is that it's super funny, and that's part of what it is to be the best book. Or I can say, it's the best book ever because I like it the best. On one view, I'm saying what makes a book the best is me liking it. On the other view, I'm saying I like it because it's the best for some independent reason. Okay? And what Plato's doing here is saying, God always likes what's good and dislikes what's bad. But God doesn't make the bad things bad. They're already bad, and God dislikes them because they're bad. And God doesn't make the good things good. They're already good, and God likes them because they're good. So God's perfection, according to Plato, consists in God sort of perfectly tracking what's good and bad and liking the good and disliking the bad. It doesn't consist in God creating goodness from nothing or creating badness from nothing. So that's the idea. So let's put this in argument form, and we're going to start with a specific moral rule rather than something general, like talking about all good actions and bad actions. And the specific moral rule will be this: killing others for fun is bad, okay, or wrong. And I'm going to add in this clause, at least provided that it doesn't produce any good consequences, because if you think the moral worth of an action just depends on its consequences, you might say, well, suppose you kill baby Hitler for fun and then the world turns out to be a beautiful place because there was no Hitler. Wouldn't that have been a good action? I'm not saying that people who are correct to think that the moral worth of an action is determined by its consequences. Instead, I'm saying this: I just want a clear example of something such that if anything is wrong, then this is wrong. So if anything is wrong, then killing others for fun when it doesn't lead to good consequences and only leads to bad consequences is wrong. And let's just shorten that by talking about killing others for fun being wrong. And let's just shorten it still by using KOFF so we can fit this on a slide more easily. So now we have an argument. If killing others for fun is wrong because God decided it is, so if the source of the moral truth is God's decision, so this is like if saying it's wrong because God doesn't like it, rather than God not liking it because it's wrong for some other reason, antecedently already wrong. So if killing others for fun is only wrong because God says it's wrong, then it wouldn't have been wrong if God had decided it wasn't wrong. So if what makes something the best book is my liking it, then Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would not be the best book if I hadn't liked it. It's not that that's not true because I'm sort of correctly tracking the value of books. It's true because on this view, my decision about what's the best determines what's the best. To get your head around the idea, you can think of a famous interview between Frost and Nixon. So Richard Nixon, the former president, was being interviewed by a famous journalist. I think his first name might have been David, but that might be wrong. But anyway, his last name's Frost. And Frost asked Nixon a series of interesting questions. And Nixon, this is after Watergate, after Nixon was removed from office for illegally spying on the Democrats during the presidential campaign. Or I shouldn't say for him illegally spying, for him lying under oath about the events of the spying. At any rate, he asked Nixon a question to which Nixon responded. Nixon responded, I'm saying that when the president says something is illegal, that makes it illegal. He wasn't claiming that the president has the ability to perfectly figure out what the law really is. He was saying there's no truth or falsity about what the law really is until the president says something. So the idea is the president's statements about what the law is determine what the law is, at least in the case he was discussing. Okay, so that's the idea here. If killing others for fun is wrong because God decided it is, then it wouldn't have been wrong if God had decided otherwise. Just like Nixon was saying, if a certain act was legal because he decided it was legal, it wouldn't have been legal if he had said it was illegal. Now, premise 2, killing others for fun would have been wrong even if God had decided otherwise. That is, even if somehow God could fail to like what's good and could instead like what's bad, even if that were something that could somehow happen, killing others for fun would still be wrong. So God saying that killing others for fun is wrong doesn't make it wrong. Instead, it's just wrong, and God, being perfect, of course, recognizes that it is wrong, recognizes that wrongness. That's what the second premise is saying. Well, now we have an argument. If killing others for fun is wrong because God decided it is, then it wouldn't have been wrong had God decided otherwise, but it would have been wrong had God decided otherwise. So by modus tollens, that is the argument form we mentioned before that says if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, which is a valid form of argument, it follows that killing others for fun isn't wrong because God decided it is. That is, God's decision doesn't make killing others for fun wrong. It's just wrong, and God, being perfect, recognizes that. That's Plato's idea. Now, there's a couple of objections you could raise here. One thing you could say is that the phrase, if God had decided otherwise, makes no sense, since God would never decide that something that is in fact wrong is okay. And there's a few replies. One is, why wouldn't God decide? Why do you think God wouldn't decide that killing others for fun is okay? So the objector here says, look, God would never say killing others for fun is okay, so this phrase makes no sense. But why not? Why wouldn't God decide that killing others for fun is okay? If you're objecting because you're trying to save the claim that the source of morality is God, you can't say back, well, God is good. Because if the moral truth comes from God herself or himself or themself, if that's where the moral truth comes from, then it's not like God is choosing to say killing others for fun is wrong because it's wrong. Instead, whatever God says, that determines the truth. And if whatever God says, that determines the truth, then you can't say, God would never choose that because it's wrong. God chooses whatever God wants to choose according to the person who says morality comes from God. And then that's what makes it good if God says it is, and makes it bad if God says it isn't good or is bad. Another objection to this argument says, God is free to choose whatever God wants, and if God chooses that killing others for fun isn't wrong, then it isn't wrong. This is what's sometimes called a bullet-biting response. So to bite a bullet in an argument is to accept a claim that on its face looks really implausible. So the idea is I have some view. My view implies something really crazy, and when I bite the bullet is to say I just accept that crazy view. Instead of changing my mind, I just say, okay, I embrace this view that seems really bad or implausible. And the idea here is that Plato the opponent of Plato might do just that. The opponent of Plato might say, well, yep, it's just 2 is false because it would have been okay to kill others for fun if God had said so. Whatever God says, that's what goes. And replies there, First, there's what's sometimes called the incredulous stare reply. Incredulous is like a disbelieving stare. So you stare at someone in disbelief, saying, how could you say that? How could you say it would be okay to kill others for fun just because God says it is? That doesn't make any sense. It's obviously wrong, no matter what. And another reply, which I think is more forceful, is this. If morality is just up to the whim of God, so if God's free to choose and say like torturing people is good, killing others is good, helping people who are in need is bad, upholding your agreements is bad. If God is free to just choose, then why should you care about morality? If God is just choosing on a whim, why should you care what God chose? That's a objection that I think has a reply to the objection, which I think has a little more force. Okay, we'll stop this video there, and in the next video we'll talk about culture as the source of morality.